So, Chapter 15 is about the bureaucracy. So, this technically falls under the executive branch, and it is often referred to as the fourth branch of government because of just how much is done via this bureaucracy. And so, basic definition of bureaucracy, like the textbook definition, is the complex structure of offices, tasks, rules, and principles of organization that are used to run our government. And here's a silly cartoon. I don't like the looks of this, and he's crawling through this hole. I only want to correct a small payroll error. And then he gets to the end. Can you help me? And this devil-looking thing. Does it help if I glare at you for disturbing my lunch? Because bureaucrats, who are the humans, the people who work within the bureaucracy, stereotypically anyway, do not want to perform their duties. In movies, this is often depicted via the DMV. Now, there are various departments in the presidential cabinet. The original cabinet that you see here on the left consisted of President Washington here, Secretary of War Henry Knox, Attorney General Edmund Randolph, Secretary of State Thomas Jefferson, and Secretary of the Treasury Alexander Hamilton. There were only those four advisors to the president. That has grown significantly. There are now 15 departments in the presidential cabinet, and you can see here a photo of President Obama and then Vice President Biden posing with all of their cabinet members here for this photograph. And there are some people who work for bureaucratic agencies that do not have an official membership in the presidential cabinet. But that does not mean that they are not valued advisors of the president. So why is there bureaucracy? Well, if you think back to Washington's first cabinet, it was because he knew he couldn't do all of the responsibilities of being president all by himself without any help. And the implementation aspect here of bureaucracy. These are the day-to-day efforts of these departments and agencies to translate law that is made by Congress and needs to be enforced by the executive branch, the president, into specific bureaucratic rules and actions. Now, the prevailing opinion within the government is that no one person or handful of people can implement the nation's laws, and therefore this extensive bureaucracy is absolutely necessary. This ties into what I said about Washington and knowing that he couldn't do things himself. Is the bureaucracy necessarily always corrupt? Because the term bureaucracy or the term bureaucrat, the individual person, is often a negative connotation. Well, there's a merit system that civil servants, such as police and fire departments, where people have to pass tests to prove they're qualified for those positions. The other thing to remember, too, is that while there are high-level politician-type bureaucrats that you might roll your eyes at, you have everyday police officers, everyday firemen and women who should get our respect and are technically part of the bureaucracy. I, as a teacher, am technically part of the bureaucracy because I technically work for the state of New York. Although I work for Lafayette Central Schools is very heavily funded through the State Education Department aid program. You have independent agencies such as the Environmental Protection Agency, the FDIC, which was created during the Depression to stabilize banking and provide insurance on people's deposits to banks, and the Central Intelligence Agencies, or Agency. These are all agencies that are not part of the presidential cabinet. So as I mentioned before, there are valued advisors of the president who are not actually part of the presidential cabinet. Government corporations are government agencies that perform a service normally provided by the private sector. So good examples, the TVA, electricity production, that was created during the Great Depression. Amtrak, that is transportation, obviously, trains. And then, of course, the Postal Service. These are often things that we kind of take for granted, but are a part of our bureaucracy. You have regulatory agencies. The Securities and Exchange Commission, again, something created during the Depression to help stabilize markets and prevent a stock market crash like they had experienced in 1929. The Federal Communications Commission, the National Labor Relations Board. So these are agencies that regulate within their realm what it is that they have power over. So Securities and Exchange, again, so this is like stock market regulation. Federal Communications Commission, so TV, radio, what is allowed on the air, what isn't. All that is regulated by the FCC. National Labor Relations Board, this is another Depression-era bureaucratic regulatory agency that was created after the Wagner Act said that labor unions were deserving of negotiation rights with their bosses, and that's known as collective bargaining. And to make sure that that is being done properly and no one's manipulating anybody else, the National Labor Relations Board is somebody that can be called to say, hey, my employer is not fairly negotiating with me in good faith. So these are regulatory agencies. These are agencies that look over what is going on in government and business to make sure that everything is being done reasonably. The Iron Triangle, you probably asked about this during the chapter assignment discussion, and if you didn't, that's okay, I'll go over it here. This is something that very, very often comes up in chapter assignment discussions because it sounds completely foreign to people. It's not even familiar in any way, shape, or form. This is, and I'll read the actual definition, the stable, cooperative relationship that often develops among a congressional committee, an administrative agency, and one or more supportive interest groups. Not all of these relationships are triangular, but the Iron Triangle is the most typical. And the other thing to remember too is that this can be positive, it can also be negative. So if you look at the examples over here, the National Cotton Council or the National Association of Wheat Growers, these are lobbying groups, interest groups. The Farm Services Agency, this is a regulatory bureaucratic agency, and then the House Agriculture Committee. All of these can work together to accomplish things in the agricultural industry. Now, what might be a corrupt version of this? Because these things can be very positive. If there's, let's say, a drought and people need farm aid from the federal government to keep their farms open and to not go bankrupt, then this would be a very important positive way to speedily get something through Congress to help them. The corrupt version of the Iron Triangle is where a lobbying group and a very friendly bureaucratic agency and a very friendly congressional committee all work together to like help each other make money. If you remember watching Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, it was probably this iron triangle system that allowed the political boss, Jim Taylor, to tell Mr. Smith, who wasn't buying it, but the other senators that he had under his control, what to do so that he could make money off of that dam in the movie. Now, fiscal policy. This is the government's use of taxing, monetary, and spending powers to manipulate the economy. And again, manipulate sounds negative, but that's not always the case. It just means that they can shape the economy. A lot of times fiscal policy, monetary policy, for example, via the Federal Reserve. The Federal Reserve, if you need to spark the economy, will lower interest rates. It's more attractive to borrow money with lower interest rates. And so then businesses and even individual citizens will borrow money, and that stimulates the economy. If the economy's flying high and they're nervous that it could spiral a little bit out of control and almost to the point of a deep recession, like if you grow too fast, too far, that is not good either. So they could raise interest rates to slow down the economy. Those are normal day-to-day things that are not really considered negative. So don't let the word manipulate in this definition make you think that everything is always negative. So you see here where taxing and spending powers are used to tax the rich, to help the poor, and close the gap between them. But then there's also the running joke, though, that I'm from the government and I'm here to help. And you can see here that money is being given to this person, but it's being taken out in order to give it. And so some people think this is actually very corrupt. You can see here one of the biggest criticisms about fiscal policy is that a lot of the programs that were initiated to help lower poverty rates in the United States, well, poverty rates were actually falling pretty consistently. You see on this graph that starts in 1950 that poverty rates are declining, and then right about here, this point here, in the mid to late 1960s, President Lyndon Johnson and his Congress that was working closely with him declared war on poverty, which means we are going to do more to help the impoverished. And this, of course, costs money. Well, then you can see, despite ups and downs over time, that poverty rates more or less stagnated right up through the graph ends in 2010, but it's not much different beyond that if you were to extend these things beyond what you see on the graph. So there's a couple of different things that could be argued from this. Is one, are these programs even worthwhile to have around? And even if you thought, well, yeah, they are worthwhile to have around, are they doing something that's not the right way of doing it? Should they change how they are going about doing it? So fiscal policy is controversial not just because of the taxation, but sometimes how that money is spent. Maybe it is not being spent in the best way. Maybe it could be spent a different way. So, as I mentioned before, the Federal Reserve System. This is a system of 12 different banks that facilitates exchanges of capital and uses monetary policies to fight inflation and deflation. You can see here a cartoon, and it insinuates that while the big, huge banks, fat cat banks, you see them here, Freddie Mac, Fannie Mae, they are very obese, and they have run out of money, and because of their irresponsibility. And here, poor Mr. Taxpayer is being told they're out of money, so you lose. Like, we're now going to bail them out with taxpayer money. Also, you have a joke here. To learn how the Federal Reserve Bank works, refer to rule number 11 of the popular board game Monopoly, in which it says here, some players think the bank is bankrupt if it runs out of money. The bank never goes bankrupt. To continue playing, use slips of paper to keep track of each player's banking transactions, until the bank has enough paper money to operate again. The banker may also issue new money on slips of ordinary paper. That is the version of the Federal Reserve printing money, which people would argue that drives inflation of the currency, that the currency therefore is less valuable. So the Federal Reserve System, while it does have an important role in regulating interest rates, it also controls the currency, and that's the side of the Federal Reserve that is much more controversial, as you can see with these political cartoons. Revenue agencies like the IRS. You can see here what a check from the United States Treasury looks like, what a 1040 return piece of paperwork to the IRS looks like, but then a couple also cartoons. One is more of a meme. I trust the IRS, said no American ever, over here on the right. And then over here on the left, you can see this one. Like the sign says, it's all theirs, the IRS, but if you connect them, theirs. Haha. I thought it was funny, so I put it on. Devolution. So this is a term where the federal government often regulates things that have to be done, but then leaves it up to states and lower levels of government, maybe even towns and counties, to execute the policy that they required. That often results in what's known as an unfunded mandate. So as a teacher, I am very much used to unfunded mandates because the state of New York often says, hey teachers, we have something new that you need to do. But they rarely say, we're going to provide this extra funding for you to achieve that. No, that hardly ever happens. So devolution often means there's rules and regulations coming from the government. In the beginning of whatever that new rule and regulation is, they might provide some funding, but then usually it runs out. So that's devolution. You can see this cartoon here. If Mozart and Michelangelo were students in today's American schools, and in bursts the teacher, Wolfgang, Mike, stop wasting time. You should be doing practice drills for the state exams. And the joke here is that we should have more well-rounded education and not just be drilling and killing with tests all the time. And then this empty wallet kind of refers to what I was saying before about unfunded mandates. Privatization is often something that is seen as a risky thing. To take something that is provided by the government and then provide it via the private sector makes people nervous because there's less of a guarantee. For example, we were talking before about the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation. That is government-backed money, essentially. So if a bank was to go belly up and you had an account at that bank, the federal government would make sure that you didn't lose your money. Privatizing things like that makes people nervous. One of the things that is most controversial in its suggested privatized versions is Social Security, which is retirement savings for the elderly. It's been suggested that it be privatized a couple of times, but people are very wary of that. You also have here, too, water for all. So a lot of things like public water here in central New York is referred to as Aqua, Onondaga County Water Authority, and which, ironically enough, rhymes with agua, which is the Spanish for water. And water, which is subsidized by the government, you do pay a water bill if you're on public water, but it is very, very low because it is subsidized by the government. And this is an ad that was out there at a time when people thought water should be purely privatized and people should pay more for their water to help pay for what the government is currently subsidizing. And this is an advertisement saying that's not a good idea. Executive privilege. You've seen these two different things before in other presentations. As a matter of fact, we've used the term executive privilege in the executive branch presentation on the presidency. This is a claim that confidential communications between a president and their close advisors should not be revealed without the consent of the president. Richard Nixon tried using executive privilege to hide his involvement in the Watergate scandal unsuccessfully because he ended up having to resign for office. President Obama successfully used executive privilege to mask information from a scandal involving guns that had been intentionally sold so that they could be tracked, and they ended up in the hands of the Mexican drug cartels, and a Border Patrol agent ended up killed with one of those firearms. So when congressional committees started investigating this and looking into the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms, the ATF for short, President Obama used executive privilege to protect his Attorney General, Eric Holder, who is included here in the vehicle, from needing to talk about any of the communications they had about it. And lastly, you have oversight. This is the effort by Congress, through hearings, investigations, and other techniques, to exercise control over the activities of executive agencies. So on one hand, you have Lois Lerner, who was a public official testifying before Congress about whether the United States government had been preventing political groups from getting what's like tax sheltered status through the IRS. It's, I believe, a 504C, 501C maybe, where essentially you pay for things tax-free because you're a non-profit organization. And any money you collect, you can then turn around and spend on political campaigns. And anyway, that some groups were being targeted based on political leanings. And so here's a cartoon where Lois Lerner says, "My computer has done nothing wrong, and it takes the fifth too," and destroys it. So just a political cartoon about that scandal at the time. And then probably one of the most famous scandals ever is Watergate, and on the right, a Newsweek cover story on the Nixon tapes. Nixon was very paranoid, and he kept a lot of recordings of meetings he had in the Oval Office, and it ended up biting him in the butt because that's what ended up exposing his involvement in the Watergate scandal, confirming actually his involvement in the Watergate scandal, and forcing him to resign from office. And all of the investigations that went into these two things are oversight. That is the end of the presentation. If you have any questions or concerns, please, by all means, reach out to me. And if you don't, I will see you in class.